East Prussia, the 20th of July, 1944. It is just past noon, and the summer heat is suffocating. Deep inside a vast military compound hidden among the lakes and forests of Masuria, a one-eyed German colonel walks briskly across a gravel path. His name is Claus Schenk, Count von Stauffenberg. He is carrying a briefcase, and inside that briefcase is a bomb. Stauffenberg enters the conference room of the Lagerbaracke, the situation barracks at Wolfschanz, the Führer's Eastern Front headquarters. Adolf Hitler is already inside, hunched over a massive oak table, listening to a report on the deteriorating situation in the East. Around the table stand some of the most senior military officers in the Third Reich. Stauffenberg takes his place among them. Exactly 7 minutes later, the world will be forever changed. What is about to unfold is one of the most astonishing chapters in the history of the Second World War, an assassination attempt on the Führer of Nazi Germany, carried out not by Allied commandos or partisan fighters, but by a group of senior officers at the very pinnacle of German military might. They called it Operation Valkyrie, and the man at its center, the man with the briefcase, was a Catholic aristocrat, a decorated war hero, a father of 4, and a man who had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand fighting for the very regime he was now trying to destroy. This is the story of Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg. It is the story of conscience against obedience, of courage against impossible odds, and of a conspiracy that came within inches of changing the course of history. It is a story of aristocrats and generals, of stolen explosives and forged orders, of a man who bet everything, his life, his family, his honor, on a single briefcase left beneath a conference table. To understand how a loyal German officer became an assassin, we need to go back to the world that made him and the war that broke him. The von Stauffenberg family was one of the oldest and most distinguished aristocratic families of southern Germany. Both Klaus's father, Alfred, and his mother, Caroline, were nobility of rank. Caroline had already presented her husband with 2 sons, the twins, Berthold and Alexander, when, in November of 1907, she decided to travel to Stauffenberg Castle in Jettingen for the birth of her next child. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was carrying twins. One of those twins, Conrad, died shortly after birth, but the other Klaus survived. For the next 10 years, the 3 boys grew up in the privileged comfort of the German nobility under Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Lautlingen estate, some 50 miles south of Stuttgart, was the home where Klaus was raised and where he would later live with his own family. It was a world of stability, tradition, and duty, a world that felt as permanent as the ancient stone walls of the family castle. In 1914, Germany declared war on both France and Russia. Caroline took tea to the soldiers passing through the local train station. In the summer, she urged her sons to help the local women now deprived of their menfolk with the harvest. In his spare time, young Klaus read voraciously and learned to play the cello, so that he and his brothers could perform as a trio, playing sonatas by Mozart and Haydn. He was, by all accounts, a sensitive and deeply thoughtful boy. The day they learned that Germany had requested an armistice, Klaus was in tears. He was still a boy when that war ended in Germany's defeat, and in what was seen by so many people, including Stauffenberg's own family, as the national humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Germany was thrown into chaos. Various mobs, communist and right-wing, vied for power. The turmoil of those years prepared the way for the rise of the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, and the political upheaval of that era made a powerful impression on young Klaus. He resolved to become an officer, for he believed that the officer corps had always served as a powerful, stabilizing force in German life. In 1926, he joined the family's traditional regiment, the 17th Cavalry Regiment, in Bamberg. Klaus had grown to be a tall and strikingly handsome young man, with a shock of dark hair, prominent cheekbones, a firm jaw, and what those who knew him described as dreamy, contemplative eyes. He was a deeply devout Catholic. He always attended Mass on Sunday, and he carried with him a conviction that would one day tear his life apart, the belief that there was always a greater authority than any earthly leader, a greater authority than even the Führer. One day, in Bamberg, he met a pretty young 16-year-old called Nina. She was at a local girls' boarding school. In 1930, after he had been promoted to second lieutenant, Klaus proposed to her, even though he was only 23. On the 26th of September, 1933, 8 months after Hitler became chancellor, Nina and Klaus were married at St. James's Church in Bamberg. He was in uniform, and he wore his steel helmet to the ceremony. To wed is to be on duty, he explained to Nina. In 1936, Klaus took the entrance exam to Berlin's prestigious war academy. His military career progressed rapidly. By 1937, he was a cavalry captain, and in 1938, he was assigned as a general staff officer to the 1st Light Division, later known as the 6th Panzer Division. His cousin, Count Cäsar von Hofacker, was already living in Berlin on the Kaiser Wilhelmstrasse. Hofacker's son would later recall the bond between them. "My father was a direct cousin of Count Claus Stauffenberg. My grandmother and the mother of Claus Stauffenberg were sisters. There was a very close relationship, and I think that had definitely something to do with why my father ended up in the resistance." That same year, 1938, the SA and SS launched the so-called Kristallnacht, when the shops and homes of Jews were smashed and many synagogues were burned to the ground. Stauffenberg had supported the idea of restricting Jewish influence in the arts and public life, a view common among the conservative German aristocracy of his era, but he strongly condemned this violence. His gradual disillusionment with the Nazi regime had irrevocably begun. Stauffenberg was serving as quartermaster of the 1st Light Division when Hitler decided to invade Poland in September of 1939. When a fellow officer tried to persuade him to help overthrow Hitler in November of that year, Stauffenberg's answer was telling. "I'm not ready yet," he said, and there was a practical reality behind those words. He was a captain on the general staff. How many opportunities to oppose a dictator and commander-in-chief are open to a captain? Stauffenberg's entire ethos was that the army existed to uphold and defend Germany. He was a loyal member of the Wehrmacht that marched into Poland. This was the regime that was leading his country, and he believed, to some extent, that this war had been forced upon Germany, that it was not solely the product of Hitler's reckless foreign policy. It was a belief that would not survive what came next. On the 10th of May, 1940, Stauffenberg was with the 6th Panzer Division as its tanks plunged into Luxembourg and Belgium, creating the spearhead of the armored divisions that crossed the Meuse and raced across France. French resistance crumbled more quickly than division headquarters in the rear could keep track of. 1 week later, to his infinite disappointment, Stauffenberg was withdrawn from the front and promoted to the Army General Staff. Before taking up his new post, Stauffenberg found time to see his family. He was now the proud father of 3 children, Franz Ludwig, Heimermann, and Berthold, named after his elder brother. 1 year later, Nina had their 4th child, a girl they called Valerie. From his perch at the Army General Staff, Stauffenberg witnessed the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The initial advances were staggering. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. It seemed, for a time, as if nothing could stop the German war machine. But it was not until later that year that the real nature of this war, its true, monstrous character, began to reveal itself. Reports of the systematic killing of Jews and Gypsies by SS troops started reaching the higher levels of the Wehrmacht. The Holocaust was already underway, and in its early stages on the Eastern Front, it was a staggeringly brutal affair, not the industrialized killings that would later occur at Auschwitz, but something raw, something more visceral and more personal in its horror. Pits were dug in fields and forests. Civilians, men, women, children, were lined up at the edge and shot. Entire communities were erased in a single afternoon. Reports of each of these atrocities traveled up through the military chain of command, and they reached officers like Stauffenberg, who read them with a growing sense of horror and disbelief. If one looks at the total number of Jews exterminated in the Holocaust, by far the largest number came from the former Soviet Union, from Byelorussia, from Ukraine, from the Baltic states. These were the territories the Germans occupied in the summer and fall of 1941, and truly horrible things happened there. Large-scale killings, carried out with methodical brutality by SS special forces known as Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units, whose sole purpose was extermination. Major General Henning von Tresckow, who was serving on the Eastern Front in Army Group Center, had been plotting Hitler's overthrow since the late 1930s. Von Tresckow understood that the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front had a unique opportunity to incubate a conspiracy, given its relative independence from the SD, the Gestapo, and the SS. In July of 1941, von Tresckow received a visitor from the General Staff Stauffenberg. The young officer agreed with Tresckow that Hitler was a danger, but he was not yet ready to join the conspiracy. As late as the second half of 1942, during one of his fact-finding tours in Ukraine, Stauffenberg remained convinced that the Eastern Front could be held. But in that same year, Stauffenberg received the first reports of the mass murder of Russian Jews by the Einsatzgruppen, and he was astonished. He was horrified. These were not battlefield casualties. These were not the collateral damages of war. This was systematic, deliberate extermination, men, women, and children murdered for no reason other than who they were. And it was being done in Germany's name. That, historians believe, is where his real conversion to the cause came. From his religious background, from his Catholic faith, there is always a greater authority, a moral law that stands above orders, above loyalty, above even the oath of allegiance to the Führer. All of this came together in the mind and conscience of Claus von Stauffenberg, and it turned a loyal member of the officer caste into a rebel. The transformation was not sudden. It had been building for years, through Kristallnacht, through the invasion of Poland, through the staggering arrogance of the Russian campaign. But the Einsatzgruppen reports were the point of no return. After that, there was no going back. He began a one-man campaign to convince commanders at the Eastern Front to confront Hitler and wrest control from him. He traveled from headquarters to headquarters, from staff meeting to staff meeting, speaking with a bluntness that startled even those who shared his views. He was so vocal in his criticism that his fellow officers became genuinely concerned, not just for his safety, but for their own. To be heard agreeing with such talk was to risk everything. That winter of 1942, the German army came to a halt before the gates of Stalingrad. What followed was one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. Even when the Sixth Army under General von Paulus faced certain annihilation, surrounded, starving, and freezing in the ruins of a city that had been ground to dust, Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal. He ordered them to fight to the last man. The Sixth Army was destroyed, and for Stauffenberg, watching from the general staff as an entire army was sacrificed to one man's vanity, the last thread of loyalty snapped. Hitler had to be removed, not tomorrow, not when conditions were right, now. But his fellow officers, alarmed by the ferocity of his conviction, decided it was safer to post him far from Berlin, far from the corridors of power where his words could do the most damage. He was transferred to the 10th Panzer Division in Tunisia, as far from the conspiracy as they could send him. It was meant to protect him. Instead, it nearly killed him. In Libya and Tunisia, the victories of the famed Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel had been reversed. The Americans had landed in North Africa during Operation Torch. Rommel launched a daring panzer attack against the still inexperienced American troops, driving them all the way to the Kasserine Pass. But the victory was short-lived. The Germans began a fighting retreat. On the 7th of April, 1943, Stauffenberg tried to lead his column through the narrow El Hafa Pass. Fighter bombers caught up with them. The attack was devastating. Stauffenberg was badly injured. He was taken to a field hospital in Sfax, where doctors did what they could. When it was over, he had lost his right hand, 2 fingers on his left hand, and his left eye. His recovery was slow but steady. On the 5th of July, he arrived back in Lautlingen for a month-long convalescence. Here, he was reunited with his children Heimermann, Franz Ludwig, and little Valerie, as well as his niece Elizabeth and nephew Alfred. The estate that had been his childhood home now became a place of healing, of quiet afternoons in the garden, of the soft voices of children who did not yet understand the storm gathering around their father. Stauffenberg learned to write with his remaining 3 fingers. He learned to dress himself, to eat, to manage the daily indignities of a body that had been torn apart by war. Those who saw him during this period remarked on something striking, not despair, but a kind of fierce, concentrated purpose, as if the injuries had burned away everything that was not essential, leaving behind only the will to act. But even as he recovered, Stauffenberg's mind was at work. He had gone to war believing in his duty as an officer. He had come home from war believing in something greater, the duty to act against tyranny, even at the cost of his own life. Around that time, the position of Chief of Staff of the General Army Office in the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin became vacant. General Albrecht, well aware of Stauffenberg's commitment to remove Hitler, quietly arranged for Stauffenberg to be offered the post. Stauffenberg immediately agreed. In August of 1943, Stauffenberg arranged to meet with Henning von Tresckow to discuss the implementation of the Valkyrie plan. Now, Valkyrie was, on the surface, an official German plan for dealing with a massive internal disturbance, whether it might be an uprising of foreign laborers or a concentrated air raid that disrupted local services. By 1944, there were 7.5 million foreign workers in Germany, and the regime genuinely feared the possibility of civil unrest. The reserve army troops with officers at the Bendlerstrasse were the men designated to execute Operation Valkyrie, and the conspirators in the resistance, the men at the Bendlerstrasse, were the ones who controlled that plan. It seemed only logical for them to turn that operational plan to their own devices. Together, Stauffenberg and Tresckow began drafting an outline of the new government that would take charge immediately after the coup d'état. General Ludwig Beck would become head of state. The longtime resistor Karl Friedrich Goerdeler would become Germany's new chancellor. Von Tresckow would take control of all German security services, including Himmler's Gestapo and SD. General Hübner would become head of the Ministry of War. Either Albrecht or Stauffenberg himself would serve as state secretary. The only minister in Hitler's government whom the plotters intended to retain, if he agreed, was the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer. Under Speer's leadership, armaments production had actually increased despite the devastating British and American bombing campaigns. Years later, Speer himself confirmed his knowledge of the plan. He knew that he had been penciled in to serve as Minister of War in the new government, had the assassination been carried off successfully. Stauffenberg increasingly became the core of the Valkyrie plan. But one major problem remained. Neither von Tresckow nor other conspirators, such as Merz von Quernheim, had actual access to the Führer. The conspiracy had a plan. It had an organization. It had willing men, but it lacked what it needed most: someone who could get close enough to Hitler to kill him. And then, in June of 1944, fate delivered what the conspirators had been waiting for. Stauffenberg was appointed Chief of Staff to none other than General Fromm, the head of the Home Army. Hitler frequently wanted to be apprised of its combat readiness, and so Stauffenberg suddenly found himself in a position where he himself would see Hitler on a regular basis. Of all the conspirators, he was now the best placed to become the assassin. At the same time, the conspiracy was expanding. Field Marshal Rommel, commander of Army Group B in France, had finally agreed to cooperate. The western arm of the conspiracy was headed by the military governor of France, General von Stülpnagel. Its success depended heavily on Stülpnagel and his deputy, none other than Stauffenberg's cousin, Cäsar von Hofacker. Hofacker's son would later describe the relationship. Stülpnagel was his immediate boss, and I think my father and Stülpnagel were very good friends at the end. Another key figure was General von Hasse, the military commander of Berlin. The plotters had men in all the right places, or so they believed, but there was a critical flaw in the plan, and everyone could see it. Stauffenberg could not be in two places at once. He was instrumental in organizing the operation of Valkyrie in Berlin. He needed to be there. He was a tremendously powerful, dynamic man who could pick up the phone and talk to all corners of Germany at once, and convince everybody to act in the way they should. His energy, his conviction, his sheer force of personality were irreplaceable. The coup had no chance without him directing it from the Bendlerstrasse. But at the same time, he had come to realize that summer that he also had to be the assassin, which meant being 300 miles to the east, planting a bomb in the map room at Rastenburg. He had to light the fuse and then somehow get back to Berlin to orchestrate the aftermath. It was a contradiction that would prove fatal to the conspiracy, because it meant that for the critical hours between the explosion and the activation of Valkyrie, the man who should have been commanding the coup would instead be sitting in an airplane. Since Stauffenberg had to remain alive and return to Berlin to orchestrate the coup, he could not use a suicide device. He would have to use a timer, a fuse, and then get out. His co-conspirator, Colonel Helmut Stief, secured the necessary bombs and fuses from a trusted contact. The explosives were British-made, obtained from captured supplies. The fuses required a special pair of pliers to activate you, squeezed the casing to break a glass vial of acid, which then slowly ate through a wire holding back a spring-loaded striker. When the wire snapped, the detonator fired. It was crude, it was dangerous, and for a man with only 3 fingers on one hand, it was an almost impossible task. The Valkyrie plan's objective was clear: decapitate the German leadership. Field Marshals von Kluge and Rommel insisted that not only Hitler but also Himmler, head of the SS, and Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, should be eliminated. The problem was that these 3 men were rarely together. On the 11th of July, Stauffenberg traveled to the Berghof Hitler's mountain retreat with Stieff. They were ready to detonate the bomb, but neither Himmler nor Göring was present. Stieff decided to call it off. 3 days later, Hitler moved his headquarters from the Berghof to Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair. Originally built in 1941 in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, Wolfschanz had since been expanded into a vast complex comprising 3 security rings. The outer ring, Security Zone 2, contained barracks and facilities for staff and guests, a communications center, and a mess hall known as Casino 2. To the northeast lay Security Zone 1, containing the offices of top figures in the Nazi leadership, including Göring, General Jodl, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. And to the immediate left of Zone 1 was the most heavily guarded sector of all, the Führer Zone. Here was a massive bunker reserved for the Führer himself, as well as air raid shelters and various wooden barracks, one of which contained a map situation room. On the 14th of July, Stauffenberg and General Fromm were summoned to appear at Wolfschanz the following day. In a famous photograph from that visit, Stauffenberg stands ramrod straight as Hitler greets General Bodensatz of the Luftwaffe. Look at that photograph closely, and you see a man whose face betrays nothing: no fear, no hesitation, no hint of the terrible resolve burning behind that single remaining eye. Back in Berlin, General Albrecht was already issuing preliminary orders for Valkyrie. But once again, Stauffenberg was prevented from setting the bomb. Himmler and Göring were not in attendance. Kluge and Rommel had been explicit. All 3 had to be eliminated, or the SS and Luftwaffe might retaliate and plunge Germany into civil war. Still, the visit was not wasted. It served as a dress rehearsal, and Stauffenberg was a meticulous planner. He observed that the chance of activating the bomb inside the Führer bunker itself was slim. The security was too tight, the opportunities too few. He would have to break the fuses somewhere else, preferably in Keitel's office complex, where a request to use a private room would not arouse suspicion. He also noted that the distance between the 2 buildings was about 400 meters, roughly 10 minutes on foot. A 10-minute fuse would not do. The acid would eat through the wire too quickly. He would still be inside the blast radius. He would need 30-minute fuses. The clock, quite literally, was being calibrated. Every detail mattered. Every second would count. On the morning of the 20th of July, 1944, a Heinkel 111 carrying Stauffenberg and his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, touched down at Rastenburg. The situation on the Eastern Front was extremely critical. The weather was very hot, and the humidity high, conditions that Hitler did not like. The overall mood at the Führer's headquarters was tense. Back in Germany, Nina von Stauffenberg went about her day not knowing what her husband was about to attempt. She later recalled, "I didn't know that my husband was going to try the assassination himself. He did tell me that, in case the attempt should fail, I shouldn't try to be loyal to him. The most important thing," he said, "was that one of us should survive to look after the children." Stauffenberg sat down for breakfast. Joining him was Captain von Mollendorf, adjutant to the Wolfschanze commander, a chance encounter that would later prove critical. Shortly after 11 o'clock, accompanied by von Haeften, Stauffenberg proceeded to the office of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel in preparation for his presentation to the Führer. Here, Stauffenberg received some disturbing news. The conference would not take place in the bunker as usual, but in a wooden building reinforced with concrete, the Lagerbaracke, the Situation Barracks. This was devastating. In the confined concrete space of the bunker, the bomb blast would have been contained. Everyone inside would have been killed, but a wooden building would allow the blast to dissipate through the walls, the windows, the very structure itself. The odds of killing Hitler had just plummeted. Then came a second blow. Keitel was told that the briefing had been rescheduled, moved forward to 12:30. Given the pending visit of Mussolini, they would have to hurry. Stauffenberg knew the bomb had to be activated immediately, but he could not simply pull out a pair of pliers and start squeezing fuse casings in front of Keitel and his staff. He asked Keitel if he could change his shirt, a plausible request in the oppressive East Prussian heat, and one that a badly wounded officer could make without suspicion. Keitel's aide, John von Freytag, took the officers to a nearby bedroom. What happened in that room over the next few minutes was one of the most extraordinary acts of physical courage in the history of the war. A one-eyed man with 3 remaining fingers on one hand, fingers that had to manipulate a pair of special pliers with enough precision to crush a tiny glass vial of acid inside a metal fuse casing, worked feverishly. Against the clock, knowing that Keitel was growing impatient, knowing that every second of delay increased the chance of discovery. Haften assisted, taking the activated fuse and inserting it into the block of plastic explosive. At that moment, at the worst possible moment, von Freytag tried to open the door to tell Stauffenberg about a phone call from General Felgebel at the communications post. Haften had just finished arming the first bomb, but the second fuse had not been crushed. Keitel sent word that Stauffenberg must hurry. There was no time to argue, no time to try again. They had run out of time. One bomb would have to do. Von Freytag offered to carry Stauffenberg's briefcase. Stauffenberg refused. "I want to sit as close to the Führer as possible," he said. "My hearing is very bad." It was a lie, of course, but a convincing one. A man with one eye and a mangled hand could easily be believed to have impaired hearing. At 12:35, they reached the conference room. Hitler was listening to a report by General Adolf Husinger, a friend of Trescow's, and the only general in the room who was aware that a plot to kill Hitler was brewing. Around the massive oak table stood some of the most powerful military men in Germany. Colonel Heinz Brandt, Colonel Rudolf Schmundt, a senior adjutant, Colonel Heinrich Borgmann of the Wehrmacht, General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, and his deputy, General Warlimont. Neither Goering nor Himmler was present, but Stauffenberg knew he must proceed. There would be no more chances. Von Freytag stepped forward and asked Colonel Brandt to move aside so that Stauffenberg, with his injuries, could be closer to Hitler. Brandt obliged. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase beneath the table, near the heavy wooden support post, as close to Hitler as he could manage. Then he told von Freytag that he had to make a phone call, and left the room. What happened next would determine the fate of nations. Outside, Stauffenberg walked quickly away from the conference room, out of the Führer zone, toward the adjutant's building where he knew General Felgebel would be waiting. Back inside, Husinger's presentation continued. The seconds ticked by, and then at 12:42, the bomb detonated. Glass and wood splinters shot through the air. The massive table on which all the situation maps were spread collapsed. The room filled with smoke and debris, and the acrid smell of burning wood and scorched fabric. Men were hurled against walls. The ceiling buckled. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence, the terrible, ringing silence that follows an explosion. And then, through the chaos, a voice cried out, "Where is the Führer?" 4 men were killed outright or would die of their wounds in the days that followed Colonel Brandt, the very officer who had unknowingly moved the briefcase, General Schmundt, General Korten, and the stenographer Berger. Several others were severely injured. The conference room was devastated, its wooden walls blown outward, its windows shattered, its roof torn open to the summer sky. But Adolf Hitler, shielded by the heavy oak table and the massive wooden support post, was alive, dazed, his hair singed, his trousers shredded, his eardrums perforated but alive. He staggered from the wreckage under his own power, and within minutes, the machinery of the Nazi state began to close around the conspirators like a steel trap. In the turmoil that followed the explosion, Stauffenberg and von Haften made their escape. As they passed the site of the shattered situation barracks, Stauffenberg saw a corpse being carried out on a stretcher, covered with Hitler's long trench coat. He was certain, absolutely certain, that he had just killed Adolf Hitler. At the first security ring, and then again at the second checkpoint, they were allowed to proceed. The Wolfschanz commandant had ordered a complete lockdown, but the order had not yet taken full effect. At the last checkpoint, Stauffenberg was stopped. He decided to call the compound commander directly. By a stroke of luck, he was put through to Captain von Mollendorf, the very officer with whom he had had breakfast that morning. Mollendorf gave him the go-ahead to leave. On the way to the airport, von Haften opened his briefcase and threw the second, unused bomb into the woods. Their Heinkel took off at 1:15 in the afternoon. Back at Wolfschanz, the truth was already emerging. Hitler was alive. The heavy oak table and the wooden post had shielded him from the worst of the blast. His shoulder was injured. His eardrums were damaged. His right arm was hurt. He would later put his hand between the buttons of his tunic, like Napoleon, to support it. But he was alive, and he was already beginning to suspect who was responsible. Felgiebel, the head of communications at Wolfschanz, saw that something had gone terribly wrong. A rumor was spreading that Hitler had survived with only minor injuries. Although a communications blackout was nominally in effect, the devastating news began to reach Berlin. At the Bendlerstrasse, General Albrecht received word that the plot may have failed. He made a fateful decision: to wait, to do nothing until Stauffenberg could report in person. Precious hours were wasted hours during which the conspirators still held the element of surprise. When Stauffenberg finally landed in Berlin, he found that nothing had been done. The Valkyrie orders had not been issued. The military units had not been mobilized. The window of opportunity was slamming shut. General Fromm, commander of the Home Army, refused to activate Plan Valkyrie. He said he had just spoken with Keitel at Wolfschanz and was told that the Führer was very much alive. Stauffenberg, who believed he had seen Hitler's corpse with his own eyes, insisted that the news from Wolfschanz was a trick, a deception that the SS was seizing control and feeding false information to prevent the army from acting. The argument grew heated. He ordered all the conspirators to be placed under arrest. But Stauffenberg was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He put Fromm under arrest instead. Together with Albrecht and Merz von Quernheim, he frantically began issuing telex orders to army units across Germany, urging them to move to their assigned locations. The coup, delayed by hours of indecision, lurched into motion. In Paris, everything went according to plan for a time. Hofacker moved with precision and speed. He went ahead and arrested all the major figures of the SS and the Gestapo in the city. But then came the problem that everyone had feared. Field Marshal Klug, the head of the military in France, had known about the resistance but had never definitively committed. There is a famous phrase attributed to Klug, one that captures the agonizing paralysis of the conspirators who hesitated. "Gentlemen, as long as that pig lives, I cannot." Klug would take his own life just 4 weeks later. And then, in Berlin, the final blow fell. The clatter of typewriters in the Bendlerstrasse came to a halt when Radio Berlin issued a communiqué. There had been an attempt on the Führer's life, the announcement declared, but Hitler was alive and would speak on the radio shortly. Looking back, it was not one failure but a sequence of events that had doomed the conspiracy from the moment the bomb detonated. The first factor was von Freytag's decision to place Stauffenberg to the right of Hitler, next to Husinger. When Brandt later kicked the briefcase, he moved it to the other side of the heavy wooden post, which then served as a shield, protecting Hitler from the full force of the blast. Had Stauffenberg been placed to Hitler's left, the explosion might have been fatal. Significantly, all of the officers killed in the blast were standing to the right of the briefcase, unshielded by any of the posts. The second setback was the phone call from Felgiebel, compounded by Keitel's impatience, which had prevented the activation of the second bomb. If Stauffenberg had been able to place both bombs in the conference room, the combined force of the explosion would almost certainly have killed everyone inside, including Hitler. But the most important factor of all was the decision to move the meeting from the bunker to the wooden conference room. Had the bomb exploded within the concrete confines of the bunker, the blast would have been contained. The pressure wave would have had nowhere to go. Everyone in the room would have been killed. Hitler was convinced that he had been saved by Providence, by the hand of God itself. Shaking hands with his left arm, since his right was injured, he proudly welcomed his guest that afternoon, Italy's former dictator, Benito Mussolini. As he showed Mussolini the ruins of the barracks, he said, "You see, there's nothing left of it. And yet, I got out without a scratch." Until that moment, suspicion had fallen on the laborers working on the barracks. But the sudden disappearance of Stauffenberg put things in an entirely different light. By evening, Hitler knew that a clique of army officers had been responsible. Back in Berlin, the final act had begun. Major Remmer, who had defied General von Hasse's orders to support the coup, arranged his troops around the Bendlerstrasse. Soon thereafter, Remmer's forces were reinforced and then replaced by the SS. Valkyrie was lost. Fromm was released from his confinement and promptly ordered the conspirators to be placed under arrest. But Fromm had a problem of his own. He had known about the conspiracy, perhaps not every detail, but enough to implicate him. And he knew that if the plotters survived to face interrogation, they would talk. Eager to cover up his complicity, Fromm decided to dispose of the conspirators immediately, before any investigation could begin. Stauffenberg, von Haeften, Albrecht, and Merz von Quernheim were summarily condemned to death. There was no trial, no deliberation. An execution detail was formed, and the condemned men were marched to the courtyard of the Bendler block. The scene was lit by the headlights of military vehicles, casting long, stark shadows across the cobblestones. At the same time, Hitler was making his radio address from Wolfschanz. His voice, shaking with rage and something that might have been disbelief, carried across the airwaves of the Reich. His final words were a declaration, "Long live our sacred Germany." It was 1 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of July, 1944, when the shots rang out in the courtyard of the Bendlerstrasse. Claus von Stauffenberg was 36 years old. Fate had perhaps been merciful to him, for what followed was far worse than a swift execution. The attempt convinced Hitler that the Wehrmacht leadership could not be trusted. He launched a savage purge of the officer corps, and used the shock of the attack to round up all the surviving members of the old opposition throughout the Reich. Those officers who had been injured or killed by the bomb were hailed as heroes. Hitler went in person to the Rastenburg hospital to pay his respects to them. For the conspirators who were captured alive, there would be no mercy and no dignity. Hitler ordered a series of show trials in the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, presided over by a dreaded judge named Roland Freisler. The trials were a grotesque theater of humiliation. Even high-ranking officers, men like Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, were forced to appear in shabby, ill-fitting clothes, their belts removed so they had to hold up their trousers, their uniforms stripped away, their medals confiscated in a calculated effort to destroy every last shred of their former dignity before the cameras. Freisler screamed at the defendants, mocked them, interrupted their attempts to speak. He was not a judge, he was a performer, playing to an audience of one. The proceedings were filmed and sent to Hitler for his private viewing. Some of those convicted were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, their final agonies recorded on film. It was cruelty beyond comprehension, but it was also, in its way, a measure of the conspirators' courage. The regime would not have needed such elaborate vengeance against men it did not fear.